Okay, so I'm about to start. All right, awesome. Well, hi everyone, welcome. I'm Lucía. You might have heard of me. I'm the CA for EUDC this year. I was a DCA for Thailand WUDC last year, and I've done quite a lot of debating across my time. I also feel very strongly about promoting debate within Latin America and also amongst ESL speakers, because I think that both of those things are very important. And at least for me, debate was really, really useful. So I sure hope that it is for other people. So what I'm going to be talking about today is about improving analysis and argumentative strategy. I think as a side note, doing both of these things is also going to massively improve your ability to get better at opening government, which I know that a lot of people find quite daunting when they start doing BP, because it's like, oh, it's the thing that you have least time to prepare for. It's very difficult. I don't know how to do it, but I actually think it's like an awesome position. It's probably my favorite position in a round. So yeah, improving analysis and strategy. And what I'm going to try and do is give you very sort of like structured methods that you just always have, because I think that although obviously talking about how you think is useful, I think forcing yourself to form habits that then force you to have good analysis until it eventually just becomes second nature is quite handy. Cool. So yeah, so just as a brief note, why do I think opening government is a great position? Because I think it has a lot to do with analysis and strategy. And it's because I think that it's the best place to guarantee a second, because you get to say the first, most obvious arguments before anyone. So it's a very easy way to basically beat your closing. The most obvious arguments are very frequently the best arguments in the round, which is why everyone immediately thinks about them. And also, it's a really good way to at least, like if you win against your opening opposition, then, and you also have the better arguments on your closing, then you've beaten two teams already, and therefore you take a second. So then what opening government, I think, is all about finding what the debate is about and setting up the correct arguments for it. So it's basically all about making sure that you have good strategy by correctly identifying what the debate is about, and also strong argumentation by running the best possible case in the strongest possible way, and that will guarantee you a second. So that's why I like OG, and here's also why I think it's important for people to practice it and to get better at it, because I think it is the best way to improve your analysis and your strategy. So yeah, so we're going to talk about basically like prep, how to come up with arguments, argument structure, and then how to fix issues in argumentation. So the first bit is prep. I am talking about this because I think that the debates are basically won and lost in the prep room. And I think it's a thing that people oftentimes don't put enough attention to. And they're like, how do I improve my argument? How do I improve my response? Whereas very frequently, it's not that you are bad at speaker, it's the case that is the problem. And that comes all the way to prep. So you've probably already heard of like this kind of prep strategy before, or you already executed, right? Like you talk individually, then you share your ideas, then you, try to not always start repeating. So here's the things that I think are helpful in terms of prepping. I think the problem when you start sharing your ideas is that a lot of it becomes quite repetitive between you and your partner. It's like, oh, I had the same ideas. I'm just going to like say them again because I don't want my partner to think that I have no new ideas and they're just carrying me or whatever. So when you share your ideas, you want to be as time efficient as possible. So you don't want to waste time repeating. You can just be like, I said the same thing. And this is the thing that I think is very useful. You want to start bundling arguments together. So very frequently, you have ideas that, although are different, are bundled under the same topic. So for example, in a debate like this, house would ban zoos. One of them is like, and you're opposing the banning of zoos. Your partner may have come up with the idea that, zoos are very important for conservation efforts because they allow you to protect species that otherwise you wouldn't be able to have. And you may have come up with the idea that zoos are very important because they allow you to do a lot of research into animals, and that's like really useful for future conservation. So obviously the analysis on those points is slightly different, but overall they go towards the same point, which is research and conservation. So those two arguments should probably be sort of tied together rather than run as different points. So I think that when you share your ideas, the thing that I do and I think is very helpful is to like write down everything and then take a look at it and then try and like mark all of the ones that are similar with like an A, an A, and an A, and a B, and a B, and a B. And then I can be like, okay, so I think that overall we have sort of two broad arguments here. Then after that, you decide on a case. And this is, I think, the bit that is important, particularly for like opening government or opening opposition. You want to ask yourself if you've answered the debate questions with a case that you currently have, and try and prioritize arguments based on that. So it's like, okay, so here are all the arguments that we have. Which ones are arguments that are going to win us the debate? And therefore, how should we execute it? So this is essentially just a brief strategy discussion. And then after you like refine your case, and then you just write your case. So for example, and this is the one that I'm like, this house should teach children to be skeptical of parental authority. If you're opening government on this motion, you may have come up with a bunch of things, right? Like schools' function is to cultivate and teach them to think for themselves. So it's important that we start with parents, that they should think for themselves. They shouldn't just take everything for granted. They should always question what people are telling them. It's also generally important to challenge authority in life, because otherwise you're very prone to like falling for what politicians tell you, taking things at face value, falling for fake news. You may also come up with the idea that we should challenge parents because oftentimes they're wrong. That you are more likely to challenge stereotypes that your parents have, like if your parents are homophobic or a bit sexist or a bit racist, it's good to challenge that. That you challenge family patterns like politics, and that schools are supposed to act as a counter to parents, that parents have a lot of power in determining who kids end up being, and therefore it's important to challenge that. And also that schools should do it because they're basically the only alternative authority to parents. So I think that then this is basically like you and your partner come up with stuff. How do you bundle it? And here's the thing that I think is helpful. So then I actually think that you can bundle them together like this. Schools' function is to cultivate individuals and teach them to think for themselves. It's important we start with parents because it's important to challenge authority in life. Like these two, I think, are very clearly similar. Equally, the second point then can be we should challenge parents because oftentimes they're wrong. There you can talk about stereotypes, family patterns, schools acting as a counter. Parents have a lot of power in determining kids. And then lastly, schools should be the ones to do it because they're the only ones who can. No one else has this capacity. So then if you look at that, just from like that prep and then bundling them together, you already have sort of three arguments. The importance of challenging authority, the fact that challenging parents gives tangible benefits in terms of improving stereotypes, politics, etc. And lastly, like the importance of schools being the only ones who can fulfill this purpose. So you already sort of have a case. And then when you discuss your strategy, you can talk about sort of, okay, what do we think the debate is mostly going to be about? It's going to be about like what yields the best in terms of educating children, what the functions of schools are. So we have arguments for those two things. So you probably then therefore want to prioritize these two arguments. But I think just from the bundling is quite a helpful way to start beefing up arguments. Because I think a lot of people do is they're like, I have 5 arguments, and then it ends up like all of them are kind of similar-ish along the same lines, and it would have actually just been stronger to run them all together. So I think this is like a useful tip that I like generally recommend quite a lot. And this is the next thing that I'm going to talk about, because I think that the biggest problem that I see, and this is something very frequently happens when you're speaking with someone who's less experienced than you, is that they're not bad speakers. I think the vast majority of the times when you speak in a pro-am, the am isn't a bad speaker. They're pretty good speakers. The main difference in skill that you notice actually happens in prep time, when like the pro is like, what ideas do you have? And they have like 1 maybe or 2. And the pro has like, okay, here's like 5 things that I think we can say. So I think that that's the biggest difference in skill. I think that in debating, the really good debaters, it isn't just that they're like very articulate and very good speakers. It's also the bits that you as an observer don't see, is the fact that behind closed doors, when they're prepping with their partner, they are very good at coming up with stuff and very good with strategy. And that's not something that happens just because they're like naturally gifted at coming up with arguments. It's something that you can train yourself to do. So how to come up with arguments? I think basically there's 2 useful ways to think about it, or at least there's multiple, obviously, but these are the ones that I find particularly helpful. This is the one that I prefer, is to think, what do I have to prove in this debate to win? What are the questions that I have to answer in order for a judge to think, yeah, you know what, they win. So again, going back to the all-time classic, this house would ban zoos. What do you have to prove to win in this motion? And I think that you can prove 2 things. you can prove either first that zoos are immoral and therefore there's something that shouldn't exist in our society and should be banned, or alternatively, you can prove that they bring more harm than good and therefore they should also be banned. If you prove either of those things, you should win the debate. Because if it's immoral but beneficial, you should maybe ban it. If it's moral but brings a lot of harms, then you should also ban it. So I think that thinking about those things then means that your strategy going into the debate is to prove those two things. So as a PM, you stand up and you're like, panel, today I'm going to show you two things. Firstly, that the existence of zoos goes against basic morality and therefore we should ban it. And secondly, is that the existence of zoos is also incredibly harmful towards education and conservation, and therefore they should also be removed. And then the panel is like, man, look at that like beautiful strategy that you just executed. You have a plan, you're following through with that plan. Then those two arguments are very clearly linked to what you should win, to why you should win. So I think this is a good way to come up with arguments, because then it's like, what do I have to prove to win? Okay, I have to prove these two things. Can I come up with reasons for why those things are true? So even if you didn't come up with like zoos being immoral in prep time, you can now make up an argument as to why they are. The second thing, because I think some people find this a little bit difficult, because what do I have to prove to win is a little bit of a vague question. So other things that I think are also helpful, particularly in motions that sound like really weird and confusing, is to think, what are the big things that are likely to be discussed? I think the reason why this is helpful is because oftentimes there's quite a lot of arguments that can be made in the debate. So then this is useful to, firstly, try and filter out the things that you can say. It's just that no one's going to care that much or argue that much about when you say them. And also from things that you're like, no one's going to dispute, so there's not going to be an argument. So for example, in this House with Ban Zoos, you could spend quite a lot of time talking about how climate change and the environment matter. It's just that it's not a thing that's likely to become a big issue because no one's going to contest it. Equally, you could probably talk a little bit about like the effect that, I don't know, littering on zoos has on the environment, but it's not a big argument, so no one's going to argue that much with it. So when I say big issues, I mean stuff that when you say it, it's going to become like a big talking point in the debate. Everyone's going to argue with you on it. And I think thinking like, okay, what are like big things that are likely to come up in the debate is quite helpful as well. So for example, in ban zoos, I immediately think animal rights is probably going to become a thing. Also education, I guess, because zoos are like educational things. Probably people are going to argue if they are more educational than less educational. I guess I could also talk about why the animals are better off in nature. So then already you have sort of like 3 talking points, and from there you can derive arguments. Okay, so animal rights, what can I say about why it violates animal rights? What can I say about education, it being bad or good? What can I say about the counterfactual, like the animals being in nature? So already there, you can also devote arguments. And I think this strategy is kind of good to try and force yourself to think of arguments, because what you're doing is finding what your path to victory is, and then making sure that you derive arguments from that, rather than trying to be like, okay, I have this set of arguments, I'm gonna like try and squeeze them into a way that I can win. I think that doing it the other way is actually quite useful, because then you are 100% sure that all of your arguments are going to contribute to you winning a debate. Obviously, different people have different ways of coming up with arguments, but I think this is a useful way to like at least ask yourself in prep time to try and come up with more stuff. So as an example, so these are all like motions that were either present at WUDC or at EUDC in the last couple of years. This house supports the rapid global elimination of both tariff and non-tariff barriers to free trade. So I think that then what I would say the overall question here is, does reduction or does increased free trade basically help or hurt economies? I think that's what you have to prove. On prop, you have to prove that free trade is really good for economic development and the uplifting of individuals. And on op, you have to prove that it isn't. That's quite vague. So then I think that you want to ask yourself, what are the big things that people are likely to argue about? I think that probably they're going to talk about what happens to local industries. And I think that probably they're going to talk about what happens when there is an increase in trade. So you can argue that an increase in trade is a really good thing or a really bad thing. So then you already have two arguments, right? If you're supporting the rapid global elimination, you can say protectionism sucks. I think protecting economies is bad. We should specialize instead. We will definitely create more jobs because there's more investment, etc. So you can make an argument about why it's better for local industries, basically. And you can also talk about why there's an overall increase in trade, and that's good when there's less barriers, because you're more likely to sell more goods to a wider number of people, and that obviously makes you more money. So then you're basically asking yourself, like, what do I have to prove to win? And then being like, okay, this is quite broad. What are things that people are likely to, talk about? I think this one is a more clear-cut, what do I have to prove to win? This one was at WUDC last year. So this house would allow children to sue their parents for religious indoctrination. I think there's two things that you need to prove to win this debate from opening government or from closing government. I think first, you need to prove that there is a harm in indoctrinating children. And second, you have to prove that the parents are responsible. Because if there is no harm, then there's no reason to sue them. Like, why are you suing me for? I did nothing to you. And if they're not responsible, then you can sue them. You're just not going to win. So I think that these are the two things that you want to prove. So I think firstly, you can talk about why religious indoctrination is a terrible thing and why it actively harms children, and therefore they should be able to get reparations from that harm or redress that harm. And second, you can make an argument about why it is also completely, or at least partially, parental responsibility, and therefore children should be allowed to sue the parental figure because they're actively responsible for having caused that harm. And then when you have both of those two questions, when you end your debate, when you end as a team, you have a very clear narrative, right? Look, panel. Parents knowingly and irresponsibly allowed for their children to be deliberately, allow for religious indoctrination to happen, and in most cases, deliberately created that indoctrination. And that indoctrination has created immense harm onto that child. It would be unjust to not allow children to sue their parents for something that it is their responsibility and that has massively affected that child's life. You sit down, and then the panel is like, yeah, you know what? I think that sounds like a winning case. They have proven what they need to prove to win. This is another one. I think that this house believes that the Mexican government should adopt measures that enable one cartel to monopolize the drug market, which include but are not limited to targeting enemy cartels, selective arrests, stopping military deployments to areas controlled by one cartel, renouncing the headhunt and its current leaders. I think then the broad question that you ask yourself about this, or the reason why you would do this, is they should do it because it's basically better for people. It creates less death. It creates less drug addiction. But I think that you can also then think about, given that this is quite a broad question in terms of what you need to prove to win, you can think about things that people are very likely to argue about. So I think that things that people are very likely to argue about is cartel violence, like does this increase or reduce violence and therefore death? And another thing that people are likely to talk about is about how does this affect drug consumption and healthcare. So there you have two arguments. So as a government team, you would stand up and be like, we're going to show you two things. We're going to show you firstly that these measures will reduce cartel violence measurably. And secondly, that there is going to be a big improvement in terms of drug consumption and in the capacity of individuals to get treatment and healthcare. And then the panel is like, yeah, you know what? They had arguments that proved the two main things that they needed to prove in the round. So I think that that's like a 1 or a 2. So I think that then the main goal or the main takeaway that I want you guys to have from this is sort of, it's not, debates are very much not just about coming up with like things to say or arguments to make. It's very much about thinking what you need to do to win and trying to make sure that your arguments allow you to execute that particular strategy. And I think that's something that you can definitely start doing from prep time that you can do later on. Another sort of like small tip that I think is helpful in terms of coming up with strategy is to look at motions carefully. So I think this is something that people like say to schools debaters, like, oh, you should do this, but you should actually do this. I oftentimes did it. So this was a motion at LSE Open 20, so last year. In countries with a lack of medical professionals, this house, rather than regulate who can be a healthcare professional, would provide optional certifications of competence. Me and my partner, Ian, we were OG in this motion, and we legit spent like 9 minutes of prep time just being like, what does this mean? What is this going to look like? Because it's super confusing. And many motions, although obviously CA teams should try and word them as well as possible, are oftentimes confusing. So I think that separating them into bits is useful. So this motion is in countries with a lack of medical professionals is the first bit. So this only takes place in places where there aren't enough nurses and doctors. It's about medical professionals, so it can be anyone basically. It could be a nurse, a dentist, a doctor, and an anesthesiologist. And what you're doing is, instead of regulating who can be a healthcare professional, so things like you only can be a doctor or a nurse if you pass this exam, you would provide optional certifications of competence. So you can basically practice. If you want, you can be a doctor without passing anything. You just have the option to take a certification. And I think that once you separate it, it becomes a lot more clear what the motion means, rather than being like staring at the full thing and being like, oh my God, I don't understand this. So that's also something that I would recommend. So this is sort of like it in terms of prep time. But again, the thing that I want to highlight is like coming up with a strategy and being good at debating, I guess, and improving your debating skills is something that very much doesn't just mean get better at the speaking, but it's also get better at the thinking, coming up with arguments, analyzing, and being strategic. Then the second thing, obviously, what happens when you actually have to make the argument. You have your case, how do you win with it? Obviously, opening government and basically any debate is about running the most obvious best case, but it's also about running it well and to a high standard. And this is the bit that I think a lot of teams oftentimes struggle with as well, which is, you know what the obvious case is. And in the vast majority of cases, when you see like a novice team versus a really good WUDC breaking team, they don't run different arguments, because again, it's about obvious cases, best cases, what's the most obvious thing you could say on this. It's just that the amount of analysis that goes into one particular argument is different. So I think that the important thing to learn from that is that very frequently our main ideas are correct. We just have to learn how to prove them better. So I think that the easiest way to begin forcing yourself to do more analysis is to, as I said, have like a specific strategy that you always have to follow in every round. And then therefore force yourself to try like to follow that structure, which forces you to analyze things. And I think that the second clear benefit on this, and this is a very specific ESL thing, is a feedback that you probably have gotten quite a lot, or at least I used to get quite a lot as a speaker when I started, was like, it was like your ideas, you had quite a lot of good ideas. It was just kind of like messy and difficult to follow. And it's a thing that obviously native speakers get much less, because they're easier to understand, easier to follow, have more clarity naturally. But I think that also the best people at having crystal clear speeches are actually second language speakers, because this will ensure, if you have good structure, that you'll never get that feedback. But I do think it's something that we have to be very aware of in terms of making sure that our strategy is crystal clear, so that no judge can ever be like, oh, it was good, but it was just like a bit messy, so I didn't know how to like slot it into the debate. So in terms of structure, you probably, again, also have seen this. It's sort of like how to structure your speech: intro, roadmap, debate setup / rebuttal, argument 1, argument 2, conclusion. That's fine. But I think the important sort of more advanced things is that overall speeches are all about storytelling, and they're all about creating a narrative of why you should win. I think this is especially important in BP debating, because obviously there's 4 teams, which means that when judges go into a deliberation room, there needs to be something about your team that they go, in a sentence, here is why I feel like they should win. If your case is a bit messy, then it's difficult for judges to put together in their heads, and it's harder for them to justify it to the panel. If you have a very sort of like, almost like a catchphrase, not like a catchphrase, but like a clear narrative, a clear story behind your theme, then judges can, in a sentence, very easily be like, here's what they said, and here's why I think they win. So this is an important thing that I think you need to do in debates, to create a narrative. So for example, this is like a YouTube video of HWS round robin debate. I do recommend HWS round robin. They're pretty like solid debates. And I think if you look at them, and try and analyze them, they all do the same thing in terms of creating that narrative. A lot of people watch debate rounds in order to copy arguments that speakers have made. I think that's wrong. And the reason why is because you're never going to be able to say those arguments in the same way, because your style is different, because emotion is going to be different. I think that instead what you should do is to watch the way that speakers structure their arguments and then attempt to copy that, because that structure, like the bare skeleton of the argument, is going to be different for each debate. So this house supports the use of eye-in-the-sky policing in urban areas with high crime rates. So it's just like constantly flying large drones over areas. So in this debate, the setup is clear. Look, it's already an aspiration of law enforcement to see everything. There's immense pressure to therefore put police in the ground and hurt these communities. It has a setup, normal protections, you need a warrant, and then they start adding some like framing stuff, right? So it's in public areas, so privacy is not a huge deal. Areas are already shattered by crime. They're high crime areas. It's really difficult already. And there's already ways we can do this in the status quo, like CCTV. So this isn't like that much of a leap. Well, then the arguments are like, firstly, it massively helps communities. This fixes crime. Why? Deterrence, it correctly predicts people and you can get better outcomes, and people trust the police more now, which means that you're more willing to report because more crime is being fixed. But the way that the speaker argues it is quite structured. He's like, it massively helps communities because it fixes crime. 3 reasons why. First reason, second reason, third reason. In the second argument is that it also improves things for the community. In the status quo, the police is very harmful to these communities for 3 reasons. They're more likely to lash out. They come down harder on criminals that you do see because their areas are very high crime. So they feel very, like they have to. There's a lot of racial hatred and tough on crime culture. Now that happens less because there's reasons, right? More information on these crimes, etc. And therefore now we can catch worse crimes. We don't need to punish low-level people and throw them in jail. We target people that are doing worse stuff. So again, I think that obviously like the argument's fine, but I think that what you want to look out particularly is at the structure of the argument, which is reasons why the status quo is bad right now. And again, very structured 3 reasons. And then reasons why that changes once you have this. So overall, I think that then this is a very good speech in terms of creating a narrative, but also in terms of having strong structure that allows the speaker to develop his analysis. So it's very like, okay, we're going to show you 2 things. We're going to show you firstly why this massively reduces crime, and second, why this helps communities that have been shattered by crime. And then when the judges sit down, the panel can be like, yeah, no, like they have 3 reasons why like this reduces crime. And they also explain how the status quo has a lot of problems in terms of how police deals with communities and how therefore this improves that. So it's very easy then for judges to argue for you winning because you have a very clear story, and also because you have a very clear structure. Like the 1, 2, 3 is a thing that any panelist can write down, and it's very easy to argue for. And basically, I want to talk about like these 2 things now. So that's sort of like your intro argument structure, right? And all arguments have like a premise. What is your argument trying to say? Then there's your explanation and evidence, which kind of goes combined. And then people frequently forget these 2 things. Arguments aren't just about showing why something is true. They're also about showing why that argument is important, and also, and this is the bit that people often forget, why they're more important than other arguments in the debate. BP is a game of comparatives, and there's just so many arguments in a BP round that you want to spend time on why something is more important than other things in the debate, which is what many judges would call weighing. We're going to go into more detail about how to do this in a bit. But I think that the main goal then is to do a bunch of things, right? To make sure, firstly, that you have a structure that allows you to develop things. And secondly, is that also you make sure that at the end of your argument, you explain why that argument is the most important thing in the round. So in terms of argument structure, the ones that I would really recommend is sort of 2 things. Firstly, is kind of like this structure. You come up with a statement, and then in prep time, you force yourself to come up with at least 2 reasons why that thing is true. So in this one, it's like, okay, why does this reduce crime? I need to come up with at least 2 reasons. And then it means that in prep time, both you and your partner have to force each other to like come up with stuff and discuss it. Whereas before you might have just gone like, oh, it helps communities because like it helps fix crime in ways that we can't specify at the moment, but we could have definitely come up with it if we thought about it more. So I think that that's a really useful way to structure arguments, to like make lists. The other really useful way is this one, which is why I picked this speech. It's to do like problems in the status quo and then how you fix those problems. And I think that a useful way to do it is also like with lists, right? So right now in the status quo, we see 3 problems, bam, bam, bam. How does that change once we implement this motion? Bam, 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 and then explain it. So I think that both of those are really handy argument structures that you should utilize in order to improve your analysis. I can't give you that, like, there's no like, oh, here's how you analyze things and then it happens everywhere. What I can give you, and this is why I think that these structures are useful, is things that you can utilize in basically every debate that you go in to force yourself to come up with your own analysis. And then the last thing, important and more important. After you finish with that, it's like, okay, why is this important? Fixing crime is important because crime is bad, whatever. Why is this the most important argument in the debate? And I think that here is where you can do some like comparative analysis against stuff that the other side has already said. So for example, the other side might say that, you know, it scares communities and they feel like their privacy is being violated. So it's like, look, this is important because like, yeah, crime, whatever. But the reason why this is much more important than whatever the opposition might say about privacy is because, firstly, there's already not that much privacy in public spaces. And we already have things like CCTV cameras. So there isn't a huge violation of privacy that people are suddenly going to feel. But more importantly is that the fact that someone feels unsafe, that they can't walk out on the street, that these communities are already shattered by crime, is a much bigger harm than moderately feeling like someone might be staring at you through a drone. So overall, we just think that the violation of privacy is not that big, and the importance of security just massively overwhelms that potential harm. And therefore, this argument is the most important thing in the round. So then, even if the judge believes the privacy stuff, you also have given within your speech reasons as to why that argument matters more. So those are my like main argument structure tips. The last bit of the workshop, I want to go through some common issues that I think happen frequently in analysis. I think they're a really useful way to sort of. So I think that there's sort of, again, as I said, that having sort of like a structure that you force yourself to repeat and therefore forces you to analyze things is quite useful. But I think that another useful way is to go through like things that people commonly mess up, I guess, and how to fix them. So the first thing that I think is quite common as an error in argumentation and that you all should look out for is mechanisms, which is kind of what I mentioned about sort of giving reasons why something is true. Teams are generally quite good at identifying mechanisms by which their benefits or harms accrue. However, they're quite bad at talking through how these work, which is really frustrating as a judge. I think it also has happened, or at least I've seen it a lot more recently, in that teams will very frequently use buzzwords like you have more political capital, or there's more checks and balances within democracy. But they don't explain what any of these terms mean. And therefore, although they identify how their mechanisms by which their benefits or harms accrue happen, they don't really explain them, and therefore you can't credit them for it. So I think that the way to fix that is you have to be very aware that you have to take it step by step. And second, you have to constantly ask yourself why and explain that. So as an example, this house believes that the feminist movement in deeply religious societies should integrate religious messages and institutions into their advocacy rather than distancing themselves from them. So I think that in this, or at least when I saw this debate happen recently, obviously an argument that you want to run is that you are more likely to gain support of religious individuals if you integrate messages into your advocacy, and then therefore you're better able to pass policy. Because you gain more support in politics and more support in voting for feminist policies. Okay, that's fine. So voting is your mechanism. You gain more political support for feminist policies. And I think most teams would be able to identify that that's a benefit that you get. Another thing that people might say is, well, you just gain much more support as a movement. You get much more members. So that's another thing that you can say, right? Like you gain more people. I think the problem is that you don't explain what either of those things mean. You don't explain how it happens. Like, how is it that you gain more members? What happens when you have those members? Like, why is having more people in your movement useful? And in the other one is like how are people going to vote for things? Like, how is this passing feminist policy happening? You're just saying that it is, but I have no clue how this is occurring. So I think that therefore taking you step by step through those things, I mean, like, look, 3 things that are going to happen once we have more religious people. Firstly is that overall, the message is going to become way more palatable to politicians that very frequently have to subscribe themselves to religion in order to be elected, because in deeply religious societies, that's something that people care a lot about. That means that the second thing happens, which is that then those politicians are able to integrate feminist advocacy into their messaging, because that then becomes coherent with a religious message. So you're much more likely to get policies that, for example, support single mothers embedded into a political bill. And then thirdly, they're going to also face less opposition once they are in parliament and people are voting on a bill. So overall, you're much more likely to therefore get feminist policy passed. This is essentially me just explaining the thing about like you're more likely to get policy voted for, but it just sounds so much nicer and much more compelling when I'm taking you step by step, even though it's basically the same thing. So that's what I mean by like explaining examples. And also, if you notice, I'm also using the sort of like there's 3 things that happen 10 10 10, and it's just like, oh wow, that's so structured, so compelling. So yeah, mechanisms I think are quite good. I think that I left you also some, like, I'll send you all the links to this workshop as well, but I think that there's some that you can also try, because I think that both of these also have good mechanisms that you can try and explain. The second thing that I think teams are quite poor at is at explaining comparatives. And this is kind of like a term that people use a lot in BP that is, you know, a bit weird. I don't know. I had like quite a hard time conceptualizing what it was when I was starting out. What is a comparative? And a comparative is just basically like there's 2 universes, one when the emotion happens and one where it doesn't. So the comparative is what happens in the world that you're not defending. So if I'm defending the emotion, like there's also banned zoos, my comparative is a world in which zoos aren't banned. So like what changes basically. And I think that teams are frequently quite bad at arguing what the comparative is and why your world is better. So in this house with banned zoos debate, it's quite easy to be like, zoos are bad. The thing that I think is a bit harder is to be like, zoos are worse than what would happen if we didn't have zoos. All debates is comparative, because if you just say zoos are bad, the other side can stand up and be like, sure, zoos are terrible, but you know what happens when you don't have zoos? All of the pandas go extinct, and that's terrible. The comparative is worse. So even if zoos aren't great, what happens in a world without them is so much more worse that we have to keep zoos. That's arguing for the comparative. So I think that in debates, it's very important to identify what the comparative is and to explain why your world is better or worse than the comparative. So frequently, teams identify the comparative. They're like, this is what happens in the other world. But frequently, they fail to explain why the world is better on a particular issue. I think that the best way to do this, and we already kind of talked about this a bit when I was talking about how to do this is more important than other things. It involves taking one metric for good and explaining how it's better or worse on both worlds. So in the zoo example, what I'm doing if I'm on the opposition is being like, the more important thing about this is conservation. So in a world without zoos, conservation is awful because you're unable to protect species that are extinct, that are endangered, that will continue to suffer because of climate change and human intervention. Whereas in a world with zoos, you're much better able to do that because you can keep them in enclosed environments surrounded by scientists and people who care for them. So you can very easily then take a metric for what's good and explain why it's better in one world than in the other. So yeah, very often teams will just explain why it's good on their side or bad on the other without engaging on why it's better than. My main tip for this one is to try and force yourself to use comparative language. So don't say it's bad, say it is worse than, or don't say it's good, say it's better than, because then you force yourself to try and argue the other thing. So as an example, this house prefers a world in which all individuals who have achieved a middle-class standard of living choose to pursue the highest level of achievement in their chosen career, rather than a world in which those individuals prioritize day-to-day enjoyment over work. Obviously kind of a mouthful. So let's say that you're in opening government. I think that a thing that you might argue for is like, okay, a middle-class standard of living actually, let's go for the op because I think it's clear in the comparative, right? On the opposition, one thing that you might say is like, it's really nice. Like you can actually derive quite a lot of pleasure from day-to-day enjoyment. Like you don't have to be super rich in order to come home, make a nice dinner, hang out with your friends, and that's all quite lovely without all the stress of work. I think that then you want to explain why that's better than the feeling that you get when you're very high achieving and are succeeding at things and you feel very successful. So I think that you might do is to be like, look, what is the comparative here? Overall, everyone has the capacity to go home and do other things, whereas very few people in a company are actually able to secure promotions. There's only one person who's going to succeed in being the CEO of a company. That means that overall, our way of achieving enjoyment is much more accessible to a larger number of people, and therefore we prioritize it. So you're essentially being like, how many people have access to this? There's more on our side than on your side, therefore we win. Comparative. Again, an example you guys can try later. The third one is weighing. As I said earlier, and here's the bit that I wanted to get at, is there's three parts to every argument, right? Like the first one is why is it true, your analysis. The second one is why does it matter, more analysis. The last one is strategy. Why does it matter more than other arguments in the debate? The last one is super important, and teams, I think, are often really bad at it. It's the best way to outframe other arguments because it's really rare that a judge will believe nothing. Like, it's very difficult for a judge to firstly believe nothing the other side says and therefore think your arguments ought to win. But secondly, even if responses are strong, it's very difficult to completely defeat an argument. If you just think about it in terms of time, if you're a prime minister or an opening government, you will spend 7 minutes making arguments. The other side will probably spend 3 minutes responding to you in LO and maybe like 4 minutes in deputy. So overall, there's actually not enough time because there's more time spent making the argument than refuting it. So it's very difficult to completely kill an argument. Very rarely will a judge believe nothing. So explaining why your argument is more important matters more, because then even if you buy both, you buy one, what you think one is more important. So it's again providing a metric by which your argument is explicitly better, which is kind of similar to the comparative thing, right? That we did earlier. Like this house supports sanctuary cities in the United States. That was the motion at Euros. So let's say that we are on, opening government. So sanctuary cities are essentially places in which like you can access services without having the government asking for your papers and whether or not you're a resident. So there's like a bunch of cities are like this, like LA. So I think one thing that you might say on opening government is like, it's really good when immigrants can access services because it means that children have education. It means that people have access to basic healthcare. That's all good. I think a thing that the opening opposition might argue is like, it makes it much harder to achieve citizenship because then the United States is like super worried, or voters are really worried about immigrants. So they're more likely to like tighten regulation and make it harder to access citizenship. I think that then what you want to do is to be like, again, kind of like provide a metric for good and then explain why your argument is better. So you make your argument and it's like, look, the other side might also. So this is important, obviously, because accessing services is good. The reason why this is more important than anything the op might say is because although not that many people are actually able to access things like citizenship, everyone who is in this city is able to get these benefits. And therefore, our side is more important because it benefits more people. So then even if the judge believes that indeed the United States gets like a bit crazier and starts making access to citizenship and green cards harder, that doesn't matter because there's very few people who would access that anyway. And therefore, it's more important that everyone has access to services like education and healthcare. On the converse, if you're on the other side, what you might say is, overall, we think it's illegal immigration is actually kind of good because a lot of migrants that cross over come from very difficult situations of poverty or running away from gang violence and cartel violence. So it's really good that they're able to come to the United States. That actually gets worse because it's not about citizenship, but rather it is about cities in the border massively tightening up border controls and being way more brutal about the ways that they use to kidnap and treat immigrants badly, like they do right now in essentially concentration camps by the border. So sanctuary cities make that so much worse because now everyone at the frontier is super freaked out about immigrants. So even if it's a bit harder to access services in a world without sanctuary cities, at least voting populations in the United States aren't so worried about immigrants invading their country that they are willing to support horrifying treatments that go against human rights abuse. And that's worse. And therefore, we prefer a world without sanctuary cities. So both of them are kind of picking a metric for good and then explaining how your side is better than the other. But it's all very like explicitly this argument matters more than the other. Another motion that you guys can try. The other thing that I think is important is examples and contextualization, which I think matters. And I think it matters for like a bunch of reasons. The first one is the one that's here, is that vagueness is really terrible. It's very difficult to land your impacts or picture mechanisms because I don't know why I care about them or why a thing happens or where it happens. So if it's just kind of like airy-fairy, I'm like, okay, I guess this like makes logical sense. I just can't really picture it. Therefore, I don't know why I should care. The other reason why I think it matters is because like it just makes you sound so much better. So it will improve your speaks a lot. Like if you watch a really good debater in an out round at an international or something, usually they will have quite a lot of examples, or like it will, which makes them just like sound knowledgeable. So judges are more likely to also give you higher speaks, which is good because speaks are helpful to, you know, breaking and stuff. So again, going back to one of the first motions that we went over earlier, this house believes that feminist movements in deeply religious society should integrate religious messages and institutions into their advocacy rather than distancing themselves from them. I think a particular thing, obviously like feminist movements in deeply religious societies, you want to kind of like give examples of what those are. So I would say that, for example, Mexico would be quite a good example. Brazil would probably be quite a good example of religious society. The USA is quite religious. The Philippines is super religious. Saudi Arabia, very religious. So those are all places where this is likely to happen. I think the bigger question is like, what policies do you expect are going to be passed now? And I think that you can go for, so in Gov, I think it's quite important that you and your partner will discuss like, what are examples? Let's set up the context, because you're probably much more likely to pass things such as, you know, support for single mothers. You're much more likely to get things such as like training of women, more access to money and like microloans to set up small businesses, probably more things like maybe affirmative action. And I think that on the up, you can stand up and be like, okay, what are the things that they're not going to be able to do anymore? Divorce, abortion. You can even say that probably like, you know, religious people don't like single mothers that much. So it's probably also gone. Support for those individuals. Goodbye, LGBT women. So I think that then it just sounds so much more powerful if on the up you stand up and go like, you're essentially going to abandon the most vulnerable women when you ally yourself with religious individuals, because now embedded in that advocacy is going to be hating on abortion, hating on women who take contraceptions, an abandonment of LGBT women. And those are all individuals that you should be protecting as a feminist movement that you're now turning your back on. And it just sounds so much more powerful than just standing up and being like, well, there's some policies that you're not going to be able to discuss anymore because religious people don't like them. So I think examples and context matter quite a lot, and they're very helpful in terms of both making your impacts larger, clearer, and also sounding better. The other one that I think is important is to engage in good faith. So engaging in the other side's best case scenario. I think it's best illustrated by an example. So like this house believes that the primary responsibility of caring for the elderly should lie on the family rather than the state. So obviously, as an like opening government, you could just be like, families are better because state homes are horrible, like living in a care home is like the worst thing in the world, nurses are abusive, doctors are horrible. Well, then that's not going to be that helpful when the op stands up and it's like, actually they're not that bad. Like, it's not that bad. The vast majority of them are actually quite okay. So then it makes you sound extreme and like you're not engaging in the vast majority of cases. So I think the best thing that you can do is to draw a spectrum. Like, obviously some of them are terrible, but let's engage with our best case scenario in which, it's nice, there's nice nurses, nice doctors, they have some contact. Why are families still better? Because then the judge is like, first of all, you responded to the best case scenario rather than try to make like the 1% of cases the main reason why we should vote for you. But also, you just sound very nuanced. That's good. So I think engaging in the best case scenario is important. There's only 2 left. The 6th one, I think, is impacting. Very annoying when a team does all the work but doesn't actually show why it matters. You need to explain impacts. And I think that very often, again, as we kind of saw in mechanisms, very often teams rely on like buzzwords like, oh, we get more informed voters, we get more human rights, you get more representation. But I have no idea what it means. I think it happens a lot in like fluffier emotions like representation, minority representation. People are like, we get more minority representation. And that is a good thing, but you want to explain why it's a good thing. Or like, we get more informed voters. Okay, like why does that matter? What does an informed voter lead to in terms of a benefit? So I think you always just want to make sure you're explaining your impacts, because it's very annoying when like you do all the work but then you don't get the benefit. Then that's like an example you can try. The last one, and this is the thing that I mentioned earlier that I think is really important, is pushing narratives. And I think I want to end with this one because I think that what I mentioned like halfway through the workshop is actually quite important. The main difference, I think, between a team that's good and a team that's really good is that very often teams will make good, solid arguments, but it's just kind of difficult to articulate why they win in discussion. So some of the most inspiring debate speeches that you will watch, they are so amazing because you sit down and they just make you feel like they're right. They make you feel like you're winning. They make you feel like their side is just correct. Like, that's why I really like watching Bo and Fanele, because like watching them is just like, oh yes, you're so right. I can't even articulate why at the moment, but like you're so right. And I think that feeling comes from the fact that those are teams that know how to push a narrative. And it's also known as like having a strategy, right? You want judges to be able to very quickly, first of all, feel like you're winning, but second of all, summarize really quickly why you win. I think that the easiest way to sort of start practicing it is when you are in prep time or when you're like practicing debate stuff, is to like get a motion, prep your case, and then be like, okay, in 30 seconds, why should I win this debate? And I think that if you can do that summary, it's helpful to like insert it at some point in your speech so that the judge can basically like parrot that back to the panel during discussion. The other 2 things, so I think that I have sort of 2 tips in terms of pushing those narratives. The first one is, I think a really good place to do that is in your introduction. Very frequently people think that introductions are a waste of time. I think that's wrong. I don't think introductions are a waste of time. I just think that people aren't using them well. I think introductions are about pushing that narrative. So in Prime Minister, you shouldn't start with like a Nelson Mandela quote or like a weird quote about philosophy that no one's going to understand. Man is born free, but ever he is in chains. What does that mean? No one knows. I think that instead what you want to start is like a 30-second summary of your case and why you should win. So again, kind of like, as we saw in like the previous one about women and the feminist movement, if you're an OO, you would stand up on a speech and be like, the most important thing that the feminist movement has to do is to fight for women. If you pass this motion, the feminist movement abandons some of the most vulnerable women and it denies them access to rights that they should have. It is abhorrent that with this motion, we're unable to campaign for things like contraception, like abortion, LGBT rights for women who deserve that. We think it's terrible that a movement that's supposed to fight for women is now abandoning them. That's why we oppose. Bam, in a sentence, this is what your case is about. And I think that's what introductions are supposed to be. I think the second thing that is really helpful to do is to, in 30 seconds or less, again, summarize why your case is and why you should win. And I think this is good to do at some point, either at the start. So very frequently, like Australian teams are quite good at this, for example. they start and go like, judge, what we're going to show you in today's closing government is this. And therefore we should win the debate. I think it's also very helpful to do in extensions when you're like, in extension, what we're going to show you is this. And once we show you that, here's the reason why that will win us the debate. The last thing that I think is helpful to do is to also try and come up with like a good conclusion of what you have shown and why you win the debate. I don't think it needs to be super inventive. I think most of my debate speeches end in, look, at the end of the day, what I said, why that's better than what the other side said. It's a really easy structure to remember, and it means that when time is running out, you need to conclude your speech. Instead of being like, blah, blah, both up, you have like a nice thing that allows you to conclude. You don't have to be super imaginative. I think it's fine to just be like, look, we showed you this, this, and that. And I think that the other side is, bah, 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 done, sit down. But yeah, I think pushing a narrative is important. It will make it much easier for judges to argue for you, which is what you want, and it make it much clearer what your team is saying. And I think just having a narrative and a story makes you as a debater much better as well. So yeah, there's like some examples there that you guys can try. So that's all that I have in terms of the workshop today. But if you guys have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them about like things that I already talked about, or things that I haven't talked about, but you have questions about relating to analysis and strategy. I'm also gonna link the presentation to you all in case you want to practice emotions. Yeah, copy link. So I'll send that on the chat. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. If you have